Thank you for the introductions, Lisa and Susan. It's awesome to be here with all of you tonight to talk about this topic, which isn't an awesome topic, but it's something that we all deal with, whether we're homeowners or we work for a park system such as myself. As you kind of heard, my career started mostly with wildlife research and ecology and quickly evolved into habitat management, which invasive species are it's a huge component. You can't get away from it. If you want to manage habitat for wildlife at home in your public green spaces, you're going to be dealing with invasive species. So I'll also note that this topic, you're not going to learn everything in an hour with me. You could spend a week I could do a week-long course with you and we would still have more to cover when it comes to invasive species and how to manage them. So the goal tonight is I will talk about some common and not so common invasives in our region that we're dealing with at home and in our parks, but I'll also give you some important background context about invasive species and understanding their ecology a little bit. So as was mentioned, I currently work for Waukesha County Parks and Land Use. We've got about 8,500 acres of public land in Waukesha County. And invasive species is kind of the name of our game, really. We've got a natural resource-based park system, so it's largely underdeveloped, a lot of natural areas and green spaces. We actively manage around 1,200 acres of land in our park system each year and control about 37 different invasive species in our park system annually as well. So just an outline of what I'll plan to cover with you all this evening. Just invasive species 101, what are they? What's being done about them on all scales? Invasives that you should know in our regions. I'll high level talk about control strategies. You'll have my contact information on the last slide, so I do encourage you, if you want to reach out with questions about a particular invasive or a question you have, please do reach out to me. I'm happy to be a resource or connect you with the resources you may need. And then kind of talk about and finish with how you can help and how you can play an active role in invasive species management in our region. So to start, just broadly, what's an invasive species? What I find kind of fascinating about invasive species is that they weren't even federally defined or handled at a federal level in the US until the 1990s, 1999, in fact, when an executive order was passed to establish the Invasive Species Council. And as part of the establishment of that council and the passing of that executive order, they defined what is an invasive species. So invasive species are non-native or alien species. They basically didn't evolve within an area, so they're non-native to an ecosystem. And the key part is their introduction may be likely to cause economic, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So that's by definition what an invasive species is. One thing I like to address early on when we're thinking about what is an invasive species, we often think of species coming from some exotic portion of the globe to our area. Invasive species can be a species that maybe is native to the United States. It just might not be native to our region. For example, the red swamp crayfish is a prohibited invasive species in the state of Wisconsin, but its native range is in the orange right here. So anywhere within the red are areas where its introduction, it was outside of its native range within the US and it became an invasive species in those areas, but it was a native species still within North America. So when we talk about invasives, we even have invasives within North America. They're not just coming from other regions of the globe, essentially. So invasive species and the spread of invasive species, really we have over 50,000 non-native species in the United States. Not all of them are invasive species. I mean, technically domestic cattle were not native at one point. So not everything that's non-native becomes an invasive species. Most of the invasive species that we have that are regulated and that we manage, they were all spread, or their spread was facilitated by international commerce. A good example of that is the emerald ash borer, which, can I get a show of hands who's familiar with emerald ash borer? I've heard of it. Small, beautiful, yet highly destructive invasive wood-boring beetle that made its way over in the packing materials on shipping crates back in the 2000s. So that species has devastated our southern lowland forests throughout the Midwest, and we've lost trillions of ash trees as a result of that. So only a fraction, though, of species introductions or non-native species that make their way here actually become established and become invasive species. Only about 1% actually become invasive pests, so that's an important thing to recognize too. And now many countries have over 20% or more of alien species in their flora and their fauna. So it's become a widespread issue, was predominantly facilitated by our ability to just move things. We're fantastic vectors, directly and indirectly, for species to move around. And one thing I find interesting too, if you want to dive into it and look at what invasive species we have in our region and where they're native to, it's interesting to look at the regions that they come from. A lot of the invasive species within the Midwest are Eurasian in their native ranges. And when you look at the climactic regions of Eurasia overall, very similar, right, in what we see here in North America. So I just show that because you think about all these species moving around. What are the odds that they have everything they need to be able to successfully thrive in an area? Well, right out of the gates, we've got very favorable climactic conditions within the Midwest, in particular for Eurasian species, and we also tend to do a lot of trade with those regions too. So aside from that, mechanisms for success. How do invasive species do so well in becoming established and becoming so aggressive on the landscape that they're outcompeting our native species? One of the first advantages that they have are phenological advantages. Who's gone for a hike in spring or fall when our trees leaf off? They've fallen or they haven't budded out yet, and you already see a lot of green in the understory. That's usually buckthorn or honeysuckle or some non-native brush. So invasive species tend to be the first to leaf out in the spring and the last to leaf drop in the fall. So they're competing for resources, taking up nutrients from the soil, competing for sunlight, and utilizing those resources that our native vegetation will need sooner into the season and later into the season than our native plants are. That right there is an advantage to an invasive species within a region. Rapid growth and reproduction. So a lot of species that we see on the invasive species list, they grow really, really quickly and they produce a lot of highly viable seed. So even within their native ranges, they do that. But the fact that they grow quickly and they reproduce at high rates is another advantage that these species have. They also have a high dispersal ability, like some of our native plants do. So an example of this is burdock, common burdock. If you have a dog or you've ever gone hiking, even along a trail, you may have found one of these burrs on you before. This is actually what Velcro was invented off of, were burdock burrs. A hunter, took one off of his hunting hound. He put it under a microscope and saw the tens of thousands of really stiff barbs and hooks on there. And he invented Velcro off of that, quite literally. So high dispersal ability, again, just like our native species, but the fact that they have all these compounding advantages over our native species helps with their invasive potential. One of the biggest ones here, advantage-wise, is that they just, outside of their natural range, they don't have a natural predator here, right? So within their native ranges, they evolve with species that may feed on them, browse on them. They evolved with pathogens or maybe funguses that may affect them, diseases that may affect them within their native ranges that just, quite frankly, for a lot of these that become invasive don't exist within their introduced ranges. So that checks and balances that exists for our native species, our native plant species, and exists for these invasive species within their native ranges just doesn't occur on the landscape here. Yet another advantage that some of these plants have. And then they tend to key in on disturbance. They do really well in areas that have been recently disturbed. So often when you see an area, that's either been mowed down or maybe a big storm came through and there was a lot of windfall, areas where there's all of a sudden a lot of sunlight available or a lot of nutrients added to the soil, invasive or non-native species tend to take advantage of those types of growing conditions more readily than our native species do. Then we also have something called the lag effect at play with non-native species. So this refers to the effect of, a species can be introduced to an area. For example, teasel. This was a species that was first introduced into New York in the 1900s, early 1900s, and it just kind of was around. It grew in certain areas. It occurred in low densities for a long time. And it wasn't until decades later, until we started installing highways, interstate highways, that teasel started to spread. And when we started spreading teasel, and these disturbance conditions along the roadside edges, us mowing those roadside edges at the same time that teasel has gone to seed, we started facilitating the spread of the species. And now this is one that I bet my bottom dollar everybody has seen this, even if they didn't know they did, growing on the sides of our highways or our county roads. But this was a species that sat at bay in low densities for quite some time before certain conditions existed for it to facilitate further spread. There's other examples of this too. Cheatgrass out in the rangelands is a highly invasive grass species. Same thing. For some reason, it sat in low densities for quite some time, and then 30 years after its noted introduction, it became extremely invasive out west. Other things that you will see the lag effect occur with are things such as insect pests, or fungal diseases too, or pathogens. They're things that we can't necessarily detect super readily, like a plant that we see growing. These microscopic organisms that could be invasive, you're not gonna notice that maybe they're there and doing anything until it's become something well established on the landscape. So in that way too, you can see the lag effect occurring. And then another big advantage that a lot of non-native invasive species have is that we just intentionally brought them here. Most of them were intentionally put onto the landscape for a purpose at the time, and whoever, when it was being introduced, they didn't know at the time it was going to become an invasive species. But if you think about it, a lot of these plants were planted all over the landscape without us individuals knowing that they were going to be invasive, and that's yet another advantage that these plants have in the landscape, is that we put them out there. Examples of this include kudzu. This is considered the vine that ate the South, and it's not far south from us at this point. It's now overwintering in Illinois, so it's making its way north, unfortunately. But that one was one that was brought to a garden exposition, and it made its way out from that point. Japanese barberry here, commonly used in landscaping, intentionally brought over as an ornamental shrub. This is one that we spend a lot of time managing in public natural areas, and it is escaping. It escapes from our yards. Birds transport the berries into the parks, and then we have to manage them in our woodlands. And then reed canary grass all the way on the right. If you can see that I have puffy under eyes, it's because reed canary grass is blooming right now, and I, over the years, maybe working out in the field with it, I've just progressively get more and more irritated by it. So maybe it's its way of punching back at me for eradicating it, I don't know. But reed canary grass is considered one of the worst wetland invasive species. If you talk to any land manager, they'll tell you it's just the biggest pain to work with, but that was intentionally introduced for erosion control purposes, and now has become one of the worst wetland invaders that we deal with on the landscape. So what's the big deal? Invasive species, we know, based on everything I've told you, you can see how they are displacing native species. With all of these mechanisms for success and the advantages that they have growing outside of their native ranges, they displace native species. And that, by default, can significantly reduce and degrade wildlife habitat. So you look at a non-native ginkgo tree, which, don't get me wrong, I love seeing those in the fall with how brilliant yellow they go. Ginkgo trees only support 5 species of caterpillars, right? You compare that to our native oak trees. A native bur oak can support over 500 species of caterpillars on it. And that's a big deal because most of our songbirds, 96% of our songbirds, feed their young caterpillars. They don't feed them seeds. They don't feed them bristly moth larvae. They need smooth butterfly caterpillars, basically. And our native trees support significantly more of those. So with predominantly invasive species on the landscape displacing native vegetation, you see a cascading effect on that ecosystem, degrading it and degrading the benefits that it can provide to wildlife. This is a golden crown kinglet caught in those burdock burrs I showed you before. I've also seen bats caught up in the burdock burrs before too. Invasives also can alter ecosystem processes. I talked to a couple people already about Phragmites or giant reedgrass. You can see it up there in that picture on the upper left. It grows about, I've seen it upwards of 20 feet tall, but on average 12 to 16 feet tall. But that's a plant just like reed canary grass. When it forms monocultures like this, it can completely alter within wetlands hydrology, completely dry up a wetland almost. So they can alter ecosystem processes. Significant economic impacts, not just in controlling invasives too, but think about property values as well. If you bought a home next to a previously forested landscape where most of that woodland was green ash and it's completely died, property values have been noted to decline for that. Phragmites, that's going to block any sort of lakefront or riparian front view that you may have. I have a stat here on it. Invasive impacts to residential housing, particularly from emerald ash borer alone, are estimated at $452 million annually, which is significant. And then there's threats to human health depending on the species. So this is wild parsnip, which is a species that we have in our region. You come into contact with it, you can get some significant rash, painful rash, boils. It's not a fun plant to deal with. I actually used to think I was immune to it, and then I got it last year for the first time. Joke's on me. So the big problem with this is that over time, if unmanaged, these species can form what we call monocultures. So here's a monoculture of garlic mustard and a woodland understory. Here we have a monoculture of purple loosestrife in a wetland. So some of these species can disrupt an ecosystem and take over and degrade native ecosystems to such an extent that that's all you really have are these monotypic, low biodiversity, degraded systems that no longer provide the ecological value that they did when native species were present. So much so that 42% of species that are listed as threatened or endangered on the endangered species list are listed because of the impacts of invasive species on their habitats. I just feel like it's a doomsday talk sometimes, but yeah, it's just gonna get harder. With one of the recent publications that came out in 2023 was the USDA updated the plant hardiness zone map. So basically this looks, based on 30-year averages of the lowest annual winter temperatures at specific locations. And in 2023, it was updated, and short of the long, our winters are getting much more mild, right? And so what does that mean when we talk about invasive species? Kudzu is a good example of this. Long, hard freezes were kind of a good holding line for species like kudzu. We're no longer getting those things, and you're seeing some of those species respond to that, extending their ranges northward. Long, prolonged cold freezes also benefited us when it came to emerald ash borer, setting that back. That's realistically not something we're going to get rid of on the landscape, but in terms of slowing the spread down in certain regions, having harsh winters used to be of benefit. Our native species were evolved to deal with those temperatures, but things are getting more mild, things are getting warmer. Additionally, with climate change, we have more extreme weather events, which I mentioned earlier. Invasive species do well with disturbance. So we have these extreme weather events that cause high disturbance events occasionally in forested landscapes, which can lead to facilitate the spread of invasives within those areas as well. And then too, when we think of climate change and carbon storage and sequestration, something like buckthorn cannot store anywhere near as much carbon as something as an oak tree. Most invasive species are not as long-lived as our native species. They're not as robust. So things like our oaks and our maples compared to buckthorn and honeysuckle, which will outcompete them, you're not getting the same benefits of carbon storage and sequestration from these invasive, particularly the woody species, if I'm referring to them, compared to something like our native species as well. All right, now we get to move towards the good news, if you want to call it good news. So what are we doing about it? On a national level, we do have that same executive order that defined what an invasive species is, also asked for the establishment of the National Invasive Species Council. So we do have at the federal level it's like high-level vision and leadership that's necessary to sustain prevention programs, early detection and rapid response programs for species that may be freshly detected on the landscape. Control and management programs are overseen and supported by this council. Research, public education and awareness, also key international cooperation, because obviously these species are moving across the globe as well within their own regions. And part of that outreach is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. I've seen several of these billboards in Milwaukee too. So National Invasive Species Awareness Week is usually every year in February. So this is a great time of year if you want to learn about invasives, to just keep your eye out for webinars and workshops that are held nationally through NISA. It's just kind of an important thing to put on your calendar, because you can get a lot of good information and a lot of hot topics when it comes to invasive species during this point in the year. At the state level, we do have an invasive species rule. So it's called NR40. That's the Wisconsin DNR invasive species rule. And what this does is it categorizes invasive species in the state into two categories: restricted species or prohibited species. A lot of those flyers that we had with the species outlined on them, you'll see that orange or the red state on there. So orange is if it's a restricted species, red is if it's prohibited. We have 128 species that are covered by Wisconsin's NR40 rule, so that's not just plants either, that includes vertebrates and invertebrates as well. So the rule breaks these species into restricted or prohibited. Restricted species are basically those like your buckthorn, your honeysuckle. They're species that are on the landscape. They're probably here to stay. Control is encouraged, but it's not required if that species occurs on a property. Prohibited species, on the other hand, sorry, I feel like my volume keeps fluctuating, and I'm almost scaring myself with my voice. Prohibited, on the other hand, those are species that are not well established within a region. And if, say, you had a prohibited species on your property or it's encountered, control can be required, depending on, obviously there's a lot of things that are circumstantial to this. But if it was on your property and, say, the state decided they were going to control it, they could even seek cost recovery for it. So prohibited species are the ones that we take really, really seriously, because they're not well established on the landscape. We have a shot at eradicating them. Even further down in terms of scale from the state, we have the Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium, CWISC for short. So CWISC is our local cooperative weed management area. We have several of those throughout the state. So the state has those CWMAs throughout it, and this is CWISC down here. So CWISC provides a lot of great resources in terms of what invasives you can find in our region, control information for invasives, as well as educational resources too. So if there's workshops or trainings that are being made available, CWISC will have them posted on their website. And they have a really great newsletter too that will just keep you up to speed on, hey, this was found in the region recently, or this was found just south of us. Keep your eye out. Here's what to do if you find it and how to report it. So we're going to talk a little bit now about species to watch out for in southeastern Wisconsin. And before I dive into that, I'll just high level go over some definitions that I'll refer to. I get the sense that a lot of folks in here have a green thumb, so you've probably heard some of these terms before. But when it comes to the severity of an invasive or how we control them, their life cycle is really important. So annual species, which I don't think we talked too much about in this particular presentation, but they'll complete their life cycle from seed to flower to producing seed all in one season. So all roots and stems and leaves on that plant are going to die annually, and then those seeds that it dropped that growing season will produce the next year's plants. Biennials, which quite a few of the invasives in our region and in this presentation are biennials, require 2 years to complete that life cycle. So within the first year, they're often small plants or rosettes, a rosette of basal leaves, or they'll send up a stalk of leaves, but they won't flower. The second year will be when they produce flowers and produce seed, set that seed, but then that individual plant will not same thing as an annual. The stems, the roots, all of that will die back, and it will just set that seed, and that seed will become the plants next year. Perennials are probably like the biggest problem, right? I mean, you think about anything perennial, they're the hardest to control, native or non-native, but they will survive for many growing seasons. Those top portions of the plant will die back each winter, but it will regrow from the roots and those root reserves. No one knows what this is. Surprise. Garlic mustard. Throw it in there. I know a lot of people know it, but I'm putting it in there because there's still time to do some work on it this year if you do have it on your property. But garlic mustard is a really aggressive biennial plant in the mustard family. Super invasive in woodland settings predominantly, but I've seen it growing out into the edges of some prairies. But it typically prefers that it can grow in full shade to partial dappled sunlight in woodlands, but it's really a problem in woodlands. It's got alternate coarsely toothed leaves. The leaves are toothed and they look like little hearts. You crush it, you do get a garlicky smell to it. It was brought over for consumption purposes. It makes a good salad green. One of my technicians that works with me, she literally eats it all spring with her lunch. I've made a pesto out of it once, which wasn't that bad. So you can do that. So yeah, those heart-shaped leaves with the coarse toothing is a good identification for it when it's either in its first year stage. So seedlings will emerge as rosettes in early spring throughout the year. You can pull it even if it's a first-year plant. Pulling super effective for garlic mustard. You just have to make sure you feel the base of the plant and you feel a kink in the stem, or the root. That's where you need to start pulling. You got to get the whole root out. Otherwise, what's always impressed me about garlic mustard is how quick it'll regrow from a snapped off root within the same season. So you can pull it when it's a first year plant. Second year plants are a lot easier to identify because you'll get the flowering stalk and those little cluster of white flowers at the top. You still have those heart-shaped, coarsely toothed leaves there. And then right now it's all gone to seed. It has not gone to seed. It's produced its seed pods as of right now, but you could still effectively pull it. You just, this time of year when it's made those pods, you gotta bag it and take it off site. When it doesn't have those pods, what we do is you'll pull them and you can even stick them in a nook of a tree or on top of a rock, let it dry out and basically desiccate, and that's effective enough. You never just wanna pull it and drop it on the ground because it'll reroot itself. I found one rerouted where we put it into a branch of a tree. It was a maple. A year later, I came back and there was a garlic mustard, I kid you not, growing in the arm of the tree. Yeah.
So if it's going to be baked, what do you do with it then? You can't necessarily throw it in your community compost and have yard waste taken.
Yeah, you don't want to put it in compost, so you keep it in the bag and it can go to the landfill. Technically, you can mark something as invasive species on the bag and it goes to the landfill. Yeah, you can burn it too. We've burned it before. But yeah, you don't want to use it in your compost, especially if it's gone to seed. If it has produced, if the pods have turned to this state where they're browned out, they're dried, you're best to just unless it's one plant and you can really carefully get everything. But if you're looking at a patch of garlic mustard that's fully gone to seed like that, you're more at risk of knocking seed further out away from the plants and getting it in the treads of your boots and spreading it. So it's best to just know I gotta get back earlier next season and control the plant. Dame's Rocket is the other invasive mustard, so it's related to garlic mustard. This is the one that I can't tell you how many times people are like, oh, it's so beautiful. I love it. You gotta kill it. We have a native woodland phlox that looks a lot like it though. So native woodland phlox and prairie phlox, I always pitch that one. It's a great substitute. So Dame's Rocket here though, similar, you can see the pods growing similar to garlic mustard. That one blooms a little later than garlic mustard, but you can control it. Control techniques are the same. Pulling is effective with it. You can use herbicides on both of these plants if needed. If you're dealing with a substantial acreage of it, sometimes that's more feasible than doing handwork on these things. But you can also cut or mow large populations. The problem I have with this as a control technique is often these things are growing side by side with native spring ephemeral wildflowers. So it's really hard when you're going in there with a mower to be discriminate about what you're mowing. So just be mindful of that. If you're trying to go chemical-free route with things and you're using mechanical equipment, just try to do your best about being very specific with what you're cutting. And with the native woodland phlox, that has 5 petals, by the way. So the Dame's rocket will just have 4 petals on it. We all know this one too, common perennial. This is an aggressive perennial invasive. So garlic mustard and Dame's rocket are both biennials, if I didn't mention that. Canada thistle is well established, as are garlic mustard and Dame's rocket in our region. But Canada thistle is an aggressive perennial, super vigorous root system. So it's really pulling it is not usually the most effective method for control, especially for significant populations of it. If you have a bad patch of it, unfortunately pulling is not super effective. You often don't get all the root, but maybe after a good rain, you would. You can treat it with herbicides if you are going to use chemical. One of the most effective ones we've ever used is called Milestone. And that's a broadleaf plant specific chemical that has pre-emergent properties to it too. So if you have a really thick, dense, big patch of it, what's nice about using something like that is that it also suppresses the seeds that the thistle has been producing as well. But that's not something you would want to stop using that before then going to plant natives in that area the next, within the same season. You need to time it appropriately. So keep that in mind if you're using something like that. Do not mow it if you see the white. I see this happen too many times. When it's gone to seed and mowing it, it's just at that point, you're just better off to wait to do control the next year versus mowing and spreading the seed further. Just let the goldfinches take advantage of it because they're going to. They love the thistle, excuse me. I don't want to say beneficial, but kind of an advantage we get with thistle control is you can control it with chemical late into the season. So usually when a lot of other plants have gone dormant and we're getting colder days in the fall, if you still see thistle growing nice and green like this, it still will be susceptible to foliar treatments or spot spraying if you have it. And that's nice because at that time of year, a lot of our native stuff has gone dormant, so you get this little window of time where you can really be specific with control. Wild parsnip, I mentioned this one a little bit earlier, so we're jumping back to a biennial. And the reason if I had to pick a favorite, I like controlling biennials is it's more satisfactory in a way because I've seen a lot more situations where we've effectively eradicated populations of biennial plants. Perennials take a lot longer to work on, but biennials, you can effectively control biennials like wild parsnip with well-timed repeated mowings over the course of a couple years. You can also take a parsnip predator, we call them. It's like a very triangular shaped small shovel and spear the taproot and pull the plant out with gloves. That was how I got it the one year. I was like, I haven't reacted to it ever before. And I did it and I got one little blister. But using a parsnip predator on the roots can be really effective. We just go out and spear if it's a couple plants. If it's a really large patch, when it's flowering, just starting to flower, which I have just seen it starting to flower this week, you can mow that at the time of flowering. And if you hit an infestation a couple years in a row with that, you can actually reduce that seed bank and eventually eradicate that population with mowing. But it is also effectively controlled with herbicides as well, again, sprayed either at the time of flowering or you can do a late season spraying similar to the thistle as well if needed. I already mentioned that it contains chemicals in the sap that will increase skin sensitivity in the sun. So you may be working on it on a cloudy day and then the next day is a sunny day and you realize that you got wild parsnip on you. One thing I've seen that's really cool is the black swallowtail caterpillars, because it's a parsley, they will use it as a host plant. So we've been out controlling parsnip before and seen like several plants being completely decimated by black swallowtail caterpillars, which are native, and they browse them to the point of the plants don't even produce a full flower or seed. So it's exciting when you get to see a native species helping you out at work like that. But I'm not using that as a plug to encourage wild parsnip. Seeds are carried by wind really easily. Parsnip is one of those plants similar to teasel that unfortunately you see spread very easily along roadways with poorly timed mowing. You tap those plants just like if you tap a teasel when it's gone to seed, you just see the seed just bust out of it. And seed remain viable from wild parsnip in the soil for up to 4 years, and it has a germination rate of like 80% within that first year. So it produces thousands of seeds per plant, and to think that 80% of them could form new plants makes it a high priority for control because it's really, really good at reproducing and spreading. You can also, if it's started to produce the seeds, so here's it in peak flower. You guys know yellow pimpernel or golden Alexander. Those are our native plants that kind of look like wild parsnip. Yellow umbel flower. When they've gone to seed, it turns into these little packets. You can still just cut the seed head off and bag that and dispose of it. So it's not too late when it's at that stage. Similar to garlic mustard though, if it's dried out and it's browned and you touch it and it looks like seeds fall, again, just you're better off to come back when you can more effectively control it the next season, unless you can ensure you're going to get every little seed. This is the native golden Alexander on the right. I get calls about this sometime. Golden Alexander blooms earlier in the year, usually in May, and that's a native species. It's got compound leaves. So these are all the little leaflets. And then this is the wild parsnip leaf, which is, it's not a compound leaf. The leaves edges are serrated, but you can see that the flowers can look very similar. But again, if it's blooming in May, it's probably not parsnip. It's going to be golden Alexander or maybe yellow pimpernel. Japanese knotweed. Anybody heard of this? Oh, yeah. This is one that I've seen a couple of people landscaping this stuff as like a screen. Like they just have a wall of it. There's someone in Waukesha that someday I need to write a letter to. But they literally have a whole wall of it that she just manicures so perfectly every year. And I just am like, yes, I gotta write that letter. I gotta write that letter someday. So Japanese knotweed, it's a fascinating, really beautiful plant. It's got this woody stem, hollow woody stem that really reminds you of a bamboo, but it's in the buckwheat family. But the stem, you cut it and it looks like a bamboo. It feels like bamboo when it dries out. It's green with this red mottling, beautiful, big, green, luscious, like spade-shaped leaves that have a flat bottom. This laser's not working. Oh, there's my laser. Pushing the wrong button the whole time, that's why. So flat right there on the bottom. The leaves alternate, and it has very reddish new growth on the stems. This is it in flower. It blooms later, so it blooms in August usually in our area. This is another one that you will see on the sides of roads, but you'll also see it show up in really high quality woodlands occasionally too. So always keep your eye out for it. It can get up to 15 feet tall if it's a giant knotweed. Japanese knotweed appears to be the most common in our area, and that gets about 10 feet tall. So it's a robust plant. And this thing can put on a lot of growth within a day. It can grow about 3 inches per day with its root system. And the root systems are super, they're just really durable. It will push up through asphalt. It grows through housing foundations. I've seen it. This stuff it's a hardcore plant. You kind of have respect for it in a sense like that. But it's highly, highly aggressive and invasive. And the root systems, because they're so vigorous, it can make it really difficult to control. It can also spread from the nodes. So in terms of controlling Japanese knotweed, you have to be really cognizant about how you're dealing with the material that you're cutting. And I really would never, even if you're mowing it, you might need to mow it if you have a big stand of it to then spray it to control it. If you're mowing it, a node of the plant, if it gets into the water or moves elsewhere, a node of that plant can vegetatively start a new plant. So you have to be very cognizant of the material when you're dealing with it. Here's Japanese knotweed. Here's what it looks like in the winter. So it really shows up nice on aerial imagery sometimes too, because it's very, very red. So the dormant or dead vegetative stems in the winter, really reddish color. This is an infestation along County Highway F. Fox River is right here. So that's a huge problem when you have it growing next to waterways, which it does like to grow like this, when I just mentioned how easy it is for a piece of that plant to transport itself and establish a new population. If it's growing next to a waterway, super, super high priority for control. And it's difficult to control. The most effective way to control it is to cut it repeatedly throughout the year and then hit it with chemical towards the end of the growing season. The idea is that it's got such a resourceful root system that you just need to stress it out and then apply herbicide in order to effectively control it. If you do have a couple plants, if it's a small infestation, we have an example of one of these in one of our parks. We actually do something, we call it like a cut stem. So we cut like the stem of the knotweed, and then we just dab the top of the stem. We treat the stem versus spraying the whole plant necessarily. So we've used glyphosate on it as well as triclopyr too, so a broadleaf specific. I prefer to use the triclopyrs work well on it, which is nice because then you're not using, glyphosate will kill anything that's growing around it too if you get any sort of overspray. Yeah, it does look like a little bit like wild cucumber. It blooms around the same time too. Be a lot of cucumber.
Which one's worse?
What?
That one's worse than
Oh yeah, the cucumber is native, and the knotweed is significant. The knotweed, nothing will grow beneath that. Yeah, nothing will grow beneath it. I've not done this, but I always thought this was interesting. You can take the shoots, eat them raw. Has a lovely sour taste like rhubarb, apparently. And then it has been cooked down into strawberry pie, vanilla knotweed reserves, even a knotweed shrub for cocktails, I guess. I don't know. Let me know how it is. This is another interesting one that seems to have just gotten really bad in our area. It's restricted within our region of the state, prohibited a bit further north. So I think it's an important one to recognize because we could easily transport it elsewhere, given how prevalent it is on our landscape. And this is a Japanese hedge parsley, another biennial. Knotweed was a perennial, so part of why it's so difficult to control, but. Japanese hedge parsley is a biennial in the carrot family. Really small, white, like just an inch or two, white umbel flower. It might have just started flowering recently, but I just got back into town, so it blooms in July and August. It's typically on par with where it shows up. Fine leaves, which make it difficult for controlling with herbicide. So often we try to control it through mowing when it's at flower because it's a biennial, or hand pulling if it's a small infestation. It does look similar to sweet Sicily. Sometimes people confuse that with, but in the next slide, when you look closely at hedge parsley, the pubescence or the hairs on the stems, they're really short and stout and they curve backwards along the stem. If this was sweet Sicily, it's usually softer, longer hairs. You can actually get kind of irritated. Your skin will get irritated if you're pulling hedge parsley without any gloves on, so make sure to wear gloves. But here you can kind of see the extent of it invading a oak woodland understory. It's not really an invasive of the prairie or super open grown dry areas. It's definitely kind of that transitional zone or woodland invasive species. It pulls really easy though, which is nice because you don't always get to say that about everything you pull. And then Japanese barberry. I mentioned this one because this has been for years throughout my career one that people just still love to use and advocate for using, and just there was for a long time a lot of stubbornness about it actually being an invasive species in our woodlands. If you're not a believer in that, I would be happy to give you a tour of a couple of our project sites. But this one, when it gets out of the landscape setting, it's a gnarly looking shrub. It puts out a lot of long leaders, kind of beautiful whorled leaves at the nodes that it also drops these bell-like blooms from that eventually form the same spot where you get the berries. Hundreds of berries on a shrub that it'll produce, and the birds do like to disperse it, which is why I think we see kind of the erratic dispersal patterns and infestation patterns in some of our woodlands. It does have the thorns on it, or the barbs, barberry, and one easy way to identify it, say if you're looking to control it or you think you have it when it doesn't have leaves or berries on it, you can just give that bark, outer bark or a root a little bit of a scrape, and it has this very distinct, like bright yellow color to the roots. It does hand pull. Little ones will hand pull easily, so if you find little ones, you can pull them. We often do the cut and stump treatment method on barberry. It's super effective. It's easy to eradicate when you find it if you don't have a ton of it, which is the good news. It's not as persistent as buckthorn in my experience.
I see a lot of ticks are around that stuff too.
Yep, a lot of ticks because it makes a great bedding area for things. Yeah.
Why are they allowed to sell invasives like that and honeysuckle and stuff? Why?
It gets hard because what's happened in the nursery trade, and I don't work in the nursery trade, but you get a lot of cultivated versions of things. So they're just hybrids of hybrids of hybrids. So really what's restricted or not allowed to be sold is the particular invasive species, but there's all these different strains of things out there, and it becomes, from what I've been told, very difficult to regulate and manage all of these different variations of these species that are out there. That was a question that I had posed at one time when I was at a conference recently, and someone, a representative from the state, was there speaking about NR40, and I had asked about, how are we, when we look at what species we're regulating, how do you go about keeping tabs on everything within the nursery industry in particular, because there's just so many variations of things, and that becomes part of the problem with regulation, is just keeping track of what is all out there. So for our state, they couldn't sell this particular strain of barberry, but there's other versions that they claim that are sterile versions that they could sell, if that makes sense. There's just...
The seeds on this is real viable too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had it up north, I was pulling it for years, and none of my neighbors were pulling it, now it's just
Yeah.
keep up with it.
Yep, it's a long-term investment when you start on that one too. Honeysuckle, most of us are familiar with, really common woodland invasive understory shrub, typically multiple stems at the base of the plant, very blonde colored bark with a dark pith if you were to cut the center there of the stem. Opposite leaves, beautiful blooms. They do smell really good too occasionally, so you'll see pollinators on this plant in the spring as well. But highly invasive in our woodland ecosystems. Effective control for honeysuckle is often what we will do is cut stump treatments, so cutting each stem, treating the stem with herbicide. One thing to note is we have been finding that Garlon, it's a triclopyr, it's common to use for treating broadleaf plants. It's not as effective on honeysuckle as it is, say, buckthorn. So we will usually treat the stumps or the foliage of honeysuckle with glyphosate versus Garlon for improved effectiveness long term. It's mixed with water if it's a foliar treatment. Foliar treatment and cut stump. We dilute with water, so our cut stump mixture is mixed with water. Yep. Yes.
So I have honeysuckle, but I noticed the slide says honeysuckle as a whole. And I was just looking up, the one that I have does say it's a cultivar
Mm-hmm.
of it. So is it primarily just the Japanese honeysuckle that is invasive, or?
There's Amur, there's Japanese, there's several species, and I think they're all listed on that sheet, but there are several species, specific species of honeysuckle that are restricted species. So yeah, you might maybe want to check it, but we also do have cultivars that are approved, and we do have native species too. Common buckthorn is another one that we're all very, very familiar with. This one, control techniques are very similar as they are with honeysuckle, so cut stump is very effective on it. We will use for foliar treatments of it, so when I say foliar treatments, it's spraying the leaves during the growing season, and the plant will uptake the chemical, translocate it to the roots, and that will kill the plant. So if we have a large area that needs to be treated in their younger plants, that's often the approach that we would take, is doing a foliar treatment on something like that. Garlon and glyphosate are effective on that as well, so broadleaf specific herbicides as well as your glyphosates will be effective on it as well. When there's seedlings like this, they do pull. After a good rain, honeysuckle and buckthorn seedlings will pull really easily, and you can effectively control seedlings that way versus using chemical or anything mechanical. We're going to be tight on time here, so I'll mention this now, but the use of fire, if you have property where you can burn, burning, particularly in the spring or fall, prescribed fire can be very effective at suppressing non-native invasive species, particularly these woody invasive species like honeysuckle and buckthorn, and that also gives native species, if you say have a natural area on your property, that also gives native species a bit of a competitive advantage, because in our region they evolved with fire on the landscape. So fire is a very effective tool for controlling particularly these two species if you have them in a natural area. But buckthorn here, false thorn at the end there. The buds lay against that twig and they look like, what did one of my interns say one year? Look like a buck hoof, a hoof of a deer or a buck, the way the two buds lay against the stem, just like that. Sweet clover, yellow sweet clover is we're switching back to biennials here, but yellow sweet clover, I saw a bunch of it when I pulled off on, I think it was Paradise Road. But that's just starting to bloom right now, so I figured I'd throw that one in, because this is one that after a good rain, it's fairly easy to pull. You can control it with mowing, but it can be a pain in gardens and in prairies. So this is an invasive of the prairies versus woodland ecosystems. It is a legume trifoliate, so you can see here with the three little leaves. Its first year, it'll send up a fairly tall plant. It'll start low and then send up a non-flowering portion of the plant in the first year, and then the second year it will get these yellow blooms that can be quite fragrant, but it stands out this time of year because it grows pretty densely along roadsides or in prairies. So like I said, it can be effectively controlled with pulling. Mowing, if it's a larger and denser infestation, can be effective too. And then it can also be effectively controlled with foliar spraying as well. Legumes, anything that's an invasive legume. I mentioned milestone when I talked about thistle. Milestone is really, really effective on legumes, anything in the legume family. So sweet clover, black locust, this next one I'm going to mention, crown vetch. This was another intentional introduction, probably super familiar because it's often in gardens. So this one's a difficult one too. To eradicate because of its growing form, the way it kind of drapes itself over other plants. So you can effectively control this one with chemical application. Otherwise, I mean, I've seen people try to pull it and it's just kind of useless to do that. It needs to be treated chemically if you can. Repeated mowing at flower can stress it and maybe suppress it, but this is just one of the ones, this one herbicide's the best tool in the toolbox for it. The pollinators do, this is just my approach to it. If you're not able to get to spraying it once it's flowered, the pollinators do just seem to love it. The bumbles just seem to love it. So it's a perennial, so often if we've not been able to spray it before it flowers, I usually you might as well just let the pollinators use it. Because otherwise you will find yourself almost spraying bumblebees. There's so much activity on crown vetch for some reason. So we'll sometimes wait and then come back. You can, similar to the thistle that I mentioned earlier, you can hit it later in the season, again as a perennial. So that's, Yeah, yep, Roundup will work. Oh, we are in the heat of this one right now. Black swallowwort. So seriously, keep your eye out for this one. We have one park with it, and I don't know how it made its way into the park. Black swallowwort, you can see it's prohibited through much of the state, and they just switched this range map now to make the restricted zones more spread out through the southern portion of the state, which is unfortunate, but it must be spreading pretty well. This is an invasive vine. It's actually in the milkweed family. You can kind of see, I mean, the flower, it's like a gothic milkweed flower. It's really cool looking, but super dark, like luscious spade-shaped leaves on this vine, and it drapes over other vegetation. It'll kind of wind itself, it'll wind up grass. It'll bind grass together and wind up grass. It's kind of wild. Drape itself over trees, gets a milkweed pod just like this. Dark purple flowers, these slender pods start forming in July and August. It's a problem because I've seen it growing everywhere. It grows in the park we have at Mukwonago County Park. It grows in our remnant prairies. It grows in the ditches. It grows in the wet areas. It grows in the deep woods and the buckthorn thickets. It even grows in the soybean fields that the farmer leases from us. So it seems to grow just about everywhere. And vines are just really, really difficult because of the fact that when you're trying to control them, if you're using chemical, they're often growing on something else that you're not wanting to target. So vines tend to be a very high priority because they are very difficult to eradicate. Here again, this is a bunch of grass it bound up, and then this is all, you can see the pods of the black swallowwort that have opened up here. For small infestations, you can repeatedly remove the pods if you get to it too late. But you can do cut stem treatments too, like I mentioned with the knotweed, cutting it and just dabbing the stem if you don't want to broadly apply herbicides in an area. The most effective herbicide we've used on this one has been triclopyr, so Garlon on it, but glyphosate or Roundup will work too. Hopefully you never find that many where you have to consider using that. They have been effective with smothering it, but the most effective control methods have been the use of chemical on this one. Pale swallowwort is prohibited in the state, but it's not far from the state. It looks almost identical, except it has pale flowers compared to the dark purple ones. So this is one I put in here just to ask you to be vigilant when you're out there on the landscape looking for it, because it's a real big problem. And it's a really big problem in large part because I mentioned it was in the milkweed family, and monarchs will lay eggs on it, but it is toxic to their caterpillars. So it's a trap. It's essentially a population trap for them. So it's really one that we don't want spreading anymore on the landscape. So definitely keep your eyes out for it as well. It's disheartening when we're out controlling it and you will literally see monarchs. You're like, go to the milkweed this way, because you'll see them laying on BSW, and it's unfortunate. Okay, lesser celandine is one that's prohibited, and it is grown. We don't manage any in Waukesha County, but when I worked with Milwaukee County Parks, we had a couple really bad infestations of lesser celandine. It's in the buttercup family. You can see why. Really low growing. Let me get to another picture. Here's some pictures of infestations of it. Low growing, grows a lot, like you almost from afar think it's marsh marigold. So always go in and check, because it may be lesser celandine in our area. Difficult to control, mostly controlled with chemical, but it has a super waxy leaf. So you have to use something like a surfactant, which are things that you add to chemical mixtures to help penetrate leaves. So almost anything you're managing, if you're spraying leaves of anything, you should be looking into adding something called a surfactant, because that just basically helps the chemical penetrate the leaf of a plant and helps with uptake and then spread throughout the system of the plant. So, but with ones like this, you can see how shiny it is. It's extra important. This one too, yeah, I think it's been around for a long time, since like the 1800s it was introduced back then. But it's got little bulbils that grow where the leaf emerges from the stem, so that can spread new plants. Pulling it's not effective, you just break it off and it doesn't pull well, so you have to either dig it out entirely or use herbicides to control. Winged burning bush. This kind of goes in the same category with the Japanese barberry. would love people not to use it. Wing burning bush, super identifiable, turns out a brilliant color in the fall, corky winging to the stem, very unique seed capsules later in the year. This one too, a prolific seed producer that spreads extensively. When it goes that color in the fall, if you drive through Manuka Park in Waukesha, it's just, you can see it throughout the woodlands. It's completely spread throughout the woods there. So we are actively managing it. But it can be controlled similar to a buckthorn or a honeysuckle. Cut stump treatments, super effective. What's been ineffective with it is we can't seem to nail down if we have an area this large, if we're not going to cut and treat each individual stump and we mow it, and we're having to treat all the resprouts that come up, it doesn't seem to, we can't find the right, I guess, concoction to work on that. We haven't had luck with what they recommend to date, but what we have seen be really effective is it does not like fire. So if we can burn an area that has wing burning bush, that seems to set us up best for controlling it with chemical right thereafter. But just spraying it has been kind of difficult. So cut stumping, if you can, is really effective with wing burning bush. But you can just see here how invasive it can really be.
Is there different types of that one?
Yeah. They're similar to a lot of the other ones. There's different variations of it. But I don't know how many of winged there are, but there's burning bush. There's a lot of euonymuses and wahoos out there. So the winged burning bush, though, is the one that's highly invasive.
Things sticking out like you were showing on.
It might be.
So make sure that was bought from a greenhouse.
Yeah. No, they were sold widely, so I wouldn't be surprised. My parents just took their last one out not that long ago.
One, now I got 3 of them.
Yeah. Good replacements for it, though. There's musclewood goes a nice color. Maple leaf viburnum. But yeah, it was I can see why it was popular. It does gorgeous color. Purple loosestrife is one of our wetland invasive species. That's restricted. Another beautiful one that we have out on the landscape column here, like a column of purple flowers here. Boxy stem with leaves whirled around it. Excuse me. So a single stem can produce up to 100 to 300,000 seeds per year. And this is a perennial plant. So again, perennials, really difficult to eradicate. So if you see purple loosestrife in low numbers, big priority for controlling if you can. If you see it in high numbers, the cool thing about purple loosestrife in our state is that we actually have a very effective biological control agent that was developed for this, thoroughly vetted, thoroughly studied, is the Galaricella beetle. So for any biocontrol, there's upwards of almost 10 years of quarantine and studying to ensure that if we release it here, what's it going to do? We do have native loosestrifes. Is it going to impact native loosestrifes? All of those things were well researched prior to using Galaricella beetles in the field for biocontrol. And I've seen this firsthand be super effective, and it's really, really cool. So what we do, and you can volunteer to do this, is we harvest loosestrife plants from the wild. Then we obtain beetles. Back in the day when they first rolled this program out, I would literally have to have beetles mailed to us through speedy delivery from the States. Now that this biocontrol program's been going for some time, you can just go to a known area where they've been released. You collect some beetles. We put them onto our nursery plants. Those beetles will reproduce, lay eggs. When those larvae hatch around this time and over the next couple weeks, then we take those plants and we take them out to an area that's super infested, looks something like this. We leave those plants there, introduce the beetles, and over time what the beetles do is they essentially browse the plants to the point where they're too stressed to flower. So then they're not setting seed. So 2 years ago we found a horrible infestation of purple loosestrife in one of our lakes, Grass Lake at Neshota Park, and it was just sad. It was just this big horseshoe of purple. We that year had beetles, so we released them, and I kid you not, the next year I didn't see one of those flowers blooming. And they're still out there. The beetles were out there this summer too. Same thing, no blooms. You just see the beetles doing their job. And over time, those plants, they're perennials, but they will be too stressed to the point where eventually you're not having seed set. Natives are competing more effectively with them. So that's something that you could get involved with if you wanted to. And it's kind of an interesting success story. Giant hogweed, prohibited. I think Sheboygan County was one of the One of the few counties in the state where this was confirmed is growing, and they've been eradicating it. I get calls for this around this time of year, every time of year, because cow parsnip, our native, is blooming, and it looks from afar a lot like it. Tall, white umbel, but you can see the giant hogweed here has really, really cut leaves, and it's huge. It's like, think Jurassic Park size plant compared to a cow parsnip, but it can spread really aggressively. So here's it spreading along a waterway. It looks like those knotweed pictures, right? Monoculture, and again, can hide 20,000 seeds with a germination rate of 50% or more. So you think about every plant that's getting established is producing potentially, 10,000 more plants that produce upwards of 20,000 seeds. So keep your eye out for giant hogweed on the landscape. Coming to the tail end here. Calorie pear is another one used commonly ornamentally. Bradford pear is another name for it. I don't know why they were used. They smell really bad. You go up and smell a calorie pear bloom and they stink. But it smells just like trash. But they beautiful white blooms in the spring and the fall. This is when I notice it the most on the landscape where it's escaped. Here's a planted calorie pear. You look at this detention basin right here. Look at all the little ones. So it's just spread. Here's a right-of-way on a highway, just all over there. So calorie pear is one that if you've got it in your landscaping, consider removing it because it's definitely one that we've seen in the last decade spreading outside of those ornamental landscapes into non-managed areas and spreading pretty aggressively. So I've talked high level about each one, control methods for invasives, just broadly. Again, you can follow up with me if you have any specific questions about something you're dealing with. But with most invasives, it's just important to know that you're going to use a concoction of things. It's usually not just one control type, one time that you're going to have to employ to effectively remove them. So we talked a lot about things you can mow, cut, pull, burn, use herbicide. Grazing is an option too. We've used prescribed grazing with goats in areas where we've had dense infestations of buckthorn or honeysuckle, biocontrol agents, but like I said, it's combinations. If you have an invasive species infestation, sometimes it's overwhelming to look at a patch of buckthorn and think, oh my goodness, where do I start? Where do I invest my time first? It can be hard to do this, but it's the most effective way to do it. Don't start where it's the worst. You want to identify the outlier plants, the outlying infestation, because those plants, by the time you would be able to effectively control where it's the worst, these have already started to spread and establish and become more of a thoroughly established infestation. So it's important that if you can identify outlier individual plants and work your way towards the densest portion of an infestation, that's usually the best method of attack if you're working with a large property and limited resources usually. I mentioned cut stump method quite a bit, so here's just visually what that looks like. So when we're controlling most of our woody invasive species, this is what we'll do. We cut the stump almost down to the ground, usually about to 4 inches, and then apply the chemical to the cambium, so the active growing tissue of woody invasives, right on that outer cusp. It's most effective to do this when plants have gone dormant. So if you're looking for a winter fun activity and you want to go cut some buckthorn or honeysuckle wing burning bush, this is something you can go do. So it's effective, most effective then, because when the plants are dormant, they're pulling all those resources into the roots. So you're applying it immediately to that stump, and it's taking that chemical down into the root reserves. That is key, though. If you're going to cut something, treat it right away, because the second you create injury to that plant, it's trying to survive. It's just going to close up, right? So most chemicals, you can read the label. It'll say you can do this within 2 weeks. Do it right away for the most effective results. You can do this now, though. I should say that too. Once the plants have leafed out fully, you can do cut stumping throughout the entire year. It's least effective in March and April, and that's mostly because what's happening that time of year, right? Things are pushing leaves out. They're pushing buds out, so they're moving water, and they're moving everything up the stem, up through the stump into the branches. So I've literally seen it where it's just, you can just see water and herbicide kind of bubbling out, not like dramatically, but you can see that it's just pushing the chemical out of the stump. So important to know that it's a great dormant season activity. What to do with your brush? You can burn it. You can create some wildlife brush piles. When I worked for Milwaukee County Parks, this is Greenfield Park, we took our wall of buckthorn that we removed here, and we actually created a natural fence to guide people to the trailhead. So you can get creative with things. The wrens and sparrows, rabbits all love a good brush pile. Basal bark treatment's another option if you don't feel like you have capacity, to cut all that material and deal with material. Basal bark treatments are something that you can do. You just apply the chemical to the lower portion of the stem. It has to be something that's at least 6 inches diameter at breast height, so a fairly large or mature tree it's most effective on. And you're using something mixed with bark oil, which is a penetrant that helps the chemical get through the outer layer, but it requires quite a bit of chemical. We don't often, honestly, use this method too much. We cut stump and we burn the brush down. But this is an option if you just don't want to create a ton of brush piles and you don't mind. You're going to have a dead standing buckthorn when you do this, but it is an effective control technique that you can utilize. Girdling's another one we do. This is us doing one to a giant buckthorn on a cedar glade over Lake Nagawicca there. But this buckthorn was growing beneath a big oak crown, and if I knew I cut it, it was going to be just going to get so hung up and be a nightmare to bring down with the chainsaw. So all I did was cut two rings into that inner cambium, just like an inch or whatever into the tree, fully around it, spaced apart about 6 to 8 inches, and then applied herbicide into those cuts, and that effectively killed that tree. So that's an option too if you don't want to deal with a bunch of brush. And then we talked quite a bit about foliar spraying, so that's when you're treating the actively growing foliage of plants. So you can do that to things like everything from garlic mustard to your honeysuckle and buckthorn. Using foliar treatments is also an option if you're looking for control. And every time we talk about herbicide use, I always just like to kind of put out the memo that they're very effective tools within restoration, but it's also, choose it wisely with some of the other tools that we have in the tools box to use, and just know what you're doing. So you can, even as just a homeowner, go through a certification course and get a certification for pesticide use. You don't have to do this legally. I recommend doing it because it's $50 and you really learn the safety behind the PPE the protection equipment you should be wearing, how to effectively use them. It doesn't hurt to do this and take some extra training if you're considering using them on your landscapes. Mowing, we talked a bit about for some species like biennials. I just always like to put the memo in. Usually we wait until mid-July to do any large-scale mowing, just because of nesting bird season too. We don't want to be mowing down a ton of brush, or if we're dealing, particularly in the brushy spots, if we're dealing with nesting bird season as well. And then prescribed fire was a huge one. I know that's not always feasible for folks to use, but if you can, it is just one of the best tools in the toolbox too. And fire followed by the use of herbicide treatment is also super effective on particularly woody invasives. And to kind of wrap up here then, restoration of native vegetation is also huge. You can spend a lot of time removing invasives and doing the control part, but getting natives back onto the landscape, if you don't see them coming from that seed bank on their own, putting native vegetation back onto the landscape so that they can compete with whatever is going to germinate out of that seed bank is key to get that because a lot of the time too you create the disturbance of doing control and you may just continue to have issues with non-native species. So having a plan for restoring native vegetation is also super important in this. Reporting new invasives. There was a few I called out. You can report them directly to the DNR has a reporting hotline. There's also EdMaps, if you're familiar with that or not. That's something that you can do right on your phone that the public has access to. And what's nice about EdMaps is that goes into a national database that I would have access to, the state would have access to, so anyone can see where an invasive is being reported. So I would know if it was seen in one of our parks that you saw when you were hiking, and the state would also know because you submitted it to a platform like this. Planting natives, I mentioned having a plan for it, but there's a lot of invasives we talked about tonight that we're brought here for ornamental landscaping purposes, just consider them consider just purchasing native when you're going to be doing landscaping. It's better for wildlife, and you don't run the risk of having it spreading out into natural areas as well. We talked about a few species that are readily spread through poorly timed mowing operations. So if you can work with local highway departments or just express like an interest in learning, like, hey, would you be open to learning more about roadway invasive management? CWISC actually has roadway management plans for a lot of those species that I talked about tonight that could be used as resources. And then if you're looking to volunteer, getting involved with organizations is another way you can help. We're always looking for volunteers to help with invasive species control. I don't know why it's jumping ahead. It knows I'm over time. So you can help with invasive removal efforts, rearing purple loosestrife nurseries, whatever it may be. You can join a pull-a-thon team. So CWISC actually has garlic mustard pull-a-thon teams every year throughout southeastern Wisconsin. Since the pull-a-thon began 12 years ago, teams have collectively pulled 115 tons of garlic mustard in Dames Rocket. So you can get in on this fun and get this gaudy trophy that we have. So join a team or start one next year if you want. There's no shortage of mustard. CWISC also offers each year invasive plant management workshops. Like I told you, I could spend a week talking to all of you, but they have a really good workshop that they do in the summer and in the fall that I would strongly encourage that you look into. They've got several really phenomenal instructors that go over everything from they'll dive into several invasive species at length. You'll get out, you'll use some of the control measures that we've talked about tonight, hands-on. And we have hosted one of these workshops at Retzer, and it was just phenomenal. So hop on their website and see if you can grab a spot. There's also the annual educational symposium that CWISC hosts every year in November. It's on November 11th this year at Havenwood State Forest Environmental Center. So it looks like, yeah, this is kind of cool. We talked a little bit about this tonight. The topic this year is Beyond Takes and Gardens, highlighting instances of invasive species in trade. So I'm sure one of the topics of that will be talking about the nursery industry a little bit and how that relates to managing invasives on the landscape. This is free to attend, and I strongly encourage going to that too. And then other trainings, I mentioned the invasive plant management workshop, pesticide applicators, prescribed burning. There's a lot of trainings out there too for that if you want to use that on your landscape too. So I apologize for going so over everybody, but like I said, there's just so much you can cover with this topic. So thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. That's my email if you have any questions or anything you want to follow up on.
I have a question.
Thank you.
I worked for the waterworks for 35 years, so I know about invasive species like this year, the Giga mussel and the alewives. However, the state of Wisconsin protects our wetland. You know, we're contractors, they can't dump it in the field and all that. However, when there's an invasive species, a wetland, they say they have no money to help with doing it. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, funding, I mean, honestly, capacity and funding, it's a constraint that we all face with this. So, I mean, if I am talking to you as like what you can do as a constituent now, your voices honestly go a long way, and it might seem just like a disappointing answer, but especially when it comes to government, I think being constituents of an area, if you're vocalizing like we want to see this be a priority, that helps. Going on record, just sending an email, being vocal about wanting to see invasive species management prioritized, that can go a long way. There's funding opportunities that we pursue grants for a lot of the work that we do related to invasive species management. We have to seek and outsource funding for it too. So unfortunately, I think it is always going to be an issue and a struggle, but that's also why it helps that we're monitoring for these things, that we're able to prioritize when there is funding to be able to go out and attack things before they get so bad that there's really no chance of actually being able to eradicate them. But it's still the reality of it, unfortunately. It's just there's not enough funding. I mean, really, the premise of the question was just what to be done. I mean, what do you do with when you're just told like there's invasives here, but there's just words of funding. We don't have funding to do anything about it. So, and that's just, you know, resources are limited to do those things. There are some grant programs that we can pursue and people can pursue for things, but I was just saying I think a big way people can help is just by vocalizing that we want to see it be prioritized on all scales.
Any other questions for Julia? Yes?
I have a question on, you didn't talk about autumn olive,
Mm.
but I have, yeah, that's my number one nemesis.
Mhm.
I hate it more than butter.
Yeah.
I've been trying to treat it with the triclopyr stump treating, and it's still flushing out sprouts for next season.
Okay.
Is there anything that works better that you found, or should I just be persistent with hitting it a second time?
Are you using 4 with bark oil or mixing it with water?
Mixing with water, I'm doing it during the, I have 12 acres and I have a lot.
Yeah.
I work a lot, so I have a limited time to do it.
You're stump treating it or foliar? Okay. I would try switching to an oil-based triclopyr. And I've been having more success with adding a little bit of kicker of milestone into stump treatments using triclopyr. So if you want to email me, I have like a whole internal database of things we've tried and how it's worked. And I'll send you some other resources. So send me an email. Yeah, autumn olives nasty. How do you pick which ones to put in? You just never know. There's so many. So I'm happy to share what we've been using on it. Yeah.
I still have this one here for like a month.
You have that, and I have my puffy eyes. Invasives they fight back.
One more question.
Yeah.
What seed you eat in Toradon? Toradon is a stump treatment too. Is that the same as triclopyr or Garland?
I believe so. We don't use too much of the Toradon. That was just something that was probably recommended from the database, so I'd have to double check that, but I believe that's a broad, like a triclopyr. I'd have to double check with the...
Affecting the ground too. I use that. And you say that other things won't come up there. It's got a residual effect that doesn't.
Yeah, that milestone will have that too. It does, yeah. It will degrade over time, that post-emergence.
The black locust.
Yep.
And then I had pines that I had planted, like spruces and stuff, not too far away, and they all died because the roots from the locust must have came in contact, and also my spruces that were ways over were dying.
Yeah, yep, yeah. So Toradon, I'd have to look what the active ingredient is on that one.
I live in the city and my neighbor next to me, well, actually, it's the person behind me property, but they have their whole back of their yard is buckthorn. And I mean, they're 15 feet high buckthorn. And I've spoken to those people that own the property, they keep moving. People keep coming, and I keep telling them that they have an invasive thing there and nobody cares. And I'm keeping it off my property by pulling it and stuff now, since it's, I don't know, you said one's restricted and one's something else. There's nothing that I can force anybody to do about it.
No, not with buckthorn, unfortunately. You just have to educate, which it sounds like you're trying to do. I don't know if CWISC does this anymore. They used to have like a template letter that they would send to landowners if they had a particular invasive growing on their property. So I mean, maybe they would even be open to helping like work on a communication.
And who would do that?
This Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium. But yeah, unfortunately, being restricted, you can't. There's no real teeth behind it anymore to really enforce anything being done.
Well, and what they did is they put up a fence, so the stuff is on the
Growing over,
on our
yeah.
side of the fence.
I'll ask my dad what he did because he actually convinced one of their neighbors to let him come over and. Granted, I don't know if you want to go remove all their buckthorn, but he got his neighbors to be open to him coming in and removing all of it. But I'm not sure how he did it, but he's
Well,
very
I'm keeping it
persuasive.
off of my property, but
Yeah.
the neighbor, this isn't even whose it is, but it's right behind his property, and,
Yeah.
and they don't seem to care. But I'm constantly trying to pull, and I'm like, I'm getting older. Sooner or later, I'm not going to be able to keep up with someone else's property.
Right, yeah. In those situations, sometimes the most you can do is just continue to try to educate and like, hey, look, I'm trying to do my part here. Can you meet me halfway, maybe?
All right, well, thank you very much, Julia, for coming
Thank
tonight.
you. Thank you.